In the summer of 1845, the most powerful navy on Earth sent 2 ships into the Arctic. They were not desperate. They were not rushing. They were confident. The British Empire believed it was on the verge of completing one of the final great achievements of exploration, the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the Arctic connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It was meant to be the last missing piece of global navigation. The expedition was led by Sir John Franklin, a veteran Arctic officer and national hero. At 59 years old, Franklin had already survived multiple polar expeditions. He was respected, disciplined, and deeply trusted by the Admiralty. Under his command were 2 ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror. They were not ordinary wooden ships. Both had been reinforced with iron plating. Both were equipped with steam engines for emergencies. Both carried advanced heating systems, libraries, scientific instruments, and enough food to last at least 3 years. More than 129 officers and men sailed aboard. The British public followed the departure closely. Newspapers described the expedition as methodical and safe. Families waved goodbye, believing the men would return celebrated, not remembered. On May 19, 1845, the ships left England. By July, they were last seen by European whalers in Baffin Bay, heading west into the Arctic. After that, nothing. At first, silence wasn't concerning. Arctic expeditions often vanished for years at a time. This was expected. The men were well supplied, the ships were strong, Franklin was experienced. But something was already wrong, and no one knew it yet. Hidden inside the ships was a flaw that would later become lethal. The expedition carried thousands of newly introduced tinned food supplies produced quickly to meet naval demand. The cans were sealed with lead solder, a common industrial practice at the time. No one considered the long-term consequences. As the ships pressed deeper into the Arctic archipelago, they encountered ice earlier than expected. Thick, unbroken pack ice closed around them near King William Island. By the winter of 1845 to 1846, the expedition was trapped. The ships did not sink. They were not crushed. They were held, motionless, by the ice. Franklin ordered the men to settle in and wait for the thaw. This, too, was not unusual. But the thaw never came. Months passed. Then another winter arrived, and with it came darkness, isolation, and the slow realization that no rescue was coming. Still, morale held, at least on the surface. The officers maintained routines. Meals were served, journals were kept, no panic was recorded. What the men did not know was that their bodies were already changing. Lead from the food cans was leaching into their meals. Scurvy began weakening muscles and joints. Cold eroded both equipment and judgment, and beneath the ice, the Arctic remained unmoved. By the time the ships had been trapped for nearly 2 years, the expedition had crossed a line from delay into disaster, and then something happened that would seal their fate. Sir John Franklin died. No details were recorded. No explanation was left behind. Only a single note would later confirm the date. Leadership passed on. Hope began to narrow, and the men were forced to make a decision no naval expedition had ever planned for: to abandon their ships and attempt to walk out of the Arctic. By April 1848, the situation had become irreversible. The ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had been locked in ice near King William Island for nearly 2 full years. The men were weakening, not collapsing yet, but changing. Scurvy stiffened joints and loosened teeth. Frostbite damaged fingers and feet beyond repair. Lead exposure dulled thinking, slowed reaction, and blurred judgment. Still, discipline held. On April 22, 1848, a written record was left behind, the only official message the expedition would ever produce. It stated the facts plainly. Sir John Franklin was dead. 24 men had already died. The remaining 105 survivors were abandoning the ships. Their plan was simple and terrible. They would march south on foot, hauling boats and supplies across ice and tundra toward the Back River, a known route that might eventually lead them to safety. It was a journey of more than 1,000 kilometers through some of the harshest terrain on Earth. They began anyway. Each man pulled a sledge weighing hundreds of pounds. Boats were mounted on runners. Supplies were rationed carefully. They were dressed as sailors, not Arctic nomads. This was not a desperate mob. It was a naval column moving in formation. What followed would not be immediate chaos. It would be slow erosion. As the men advanced, Inuit hunters in the region observed them from a distance. Later testimony described the same details again and again. The men walked stiffly. They struggled with loads no human should have carried that far. They refused help. British naval discipline forbade accepting assistance that might compromise authority. This decision would cost lives. Within weeks, men began to fall behind. Some collapsed and were left where they lay. Others were buried under shallow stone cairns. A few were never buried at all. Evidence found decades later showed discarded equipment along the route. Silverware, books, personal items no starving man would normally abandon. But starvation does not follow logic. As the march continued, physical deterioration accelerated. The Arctic did not care about rank. Officers died alongside sailors. Strength offered no protection. At some point, cohesion broke. Small groups splintered from the main column. Some attempted alternate routes. Others turned back toward the ships. None were ever seen alive again. When search expeditions later recovered remains along the southern coast of King William Island, they noticed something disturbing. Bones had been broken after death. Long bones were split lengthwise. Skulls showed cut marks. These were not animal scavenging marks. They were human. At first, the British establishment rejected the conclusion outright. Cannibalism was unthinkable for Royal Navy sailors, but the evidence accumulated. Inuit testimony described emaciated men eating the bodies of the dead. Archaeological analysis confirmed knife marks consistent with defleshing. The pattern repeated across multiple sites. This was not an isolated act. It was survival. By the time the last men died, the expedition no longer resembled an organized unit. It had become fragments of individuals moving until they could no longer move at all. Some died near the water's edge, as if hoping the river itself might save them. Others died inland, far from any possible help. No one reached civilization. Not one. For more than a century after the Franklin expedition vanished, the Arctic kept its answers buried. Search parties found scattered bones, fragments of clothing, and abandoned camps. But no clear explanation for how a well-equipped naval expedition collapsed so completely. That began to change in the late 20th century. When archaeologists and forensic scientists returned to King William Island, they stopped looking for journals and started examining remains. What they found rewrote the story. Skeletons recovered along the southern coast showed consistent, unmistakable patterns. Bones were brittle. Teeth were loose or missing. Joints showed signs of severe degeneration. These were classic indicators of advanced scurvy, a disease caused by prolonged vitamin C deficiency. But scurvy alone did not explain the speed or severity of the collapse. Then came the chemical analysis. In the 1980s, researchers tested bone samples from expedition members for heavy metals. The results were alarming. Lead levels were extremely high, far beyond what could be explained by environmental exposure. This was not incidental contamination. It was systemic poisoning. The source traced back to the expedition's food supply. Thousands of tin cans had been hastily produced for the voyage, sealed with thick lead solder. In the cold, acidic environment, lead had leached directly into the food, day after day, month after month, year after year. The men were poisoning themselves slowly and without knowing it. Lead poisoning causes confusion, depression, impaired judgment, muscle weakness, and gastrointestinal failure. Symptoms that matched historical accounts almost perfectly. Men dragging unnecessary items for miles, poor decision-making at critical moments, rigid adherence to discipline even when it became lethal. They were not simply stubborn, their minds were failing. Examinations of skulls revealed something else. Many showed cut marks consistent with knife use. Some had fractures caused after death when bone was still fresh. This confirmed what Inuit testimony had described decades earlier, and what Victorian Britain had refused to accept. Cannibalism occurred. Not ritualistic, not widespread madness, but controlled, desperate attempts to survive. The pattern suggested the dead were processed deliberately. Muscle removed, marrow extracted, skulls opened. This was the final stage of starvation. Still, one question remained. Why did the expedition fail so completely when other Arctic journeys, equally harsh, had survived? The answer lay in contrast. Inuit communities in the region thrived using local knowledge. Hunting seals, building snow shelters, traveling light. Franklin's men relied on European systems, preserved food, heavy equipment, rigid hierarchy. When those systems failed, they had nothing to replace them. The Arctic punished inflexibility. As remains were cataloged, another pattern emerged. Many bodies were found near water, rivers, shorelines, ice edges, as if the men believed that reaching water meant reaching safety. But by then, safety no longer existed. The last survivors likely died isolated, confused, and physically incapable of adapting. They did not understand why they were failing. They only knew they were. For years after the Franklin expedition vanished, the British Admiralty waited. Silence at first meant nothing. Arctic voyages disappeared routinely and returned just as quietly. But by 1848, concern turned into alarm. No messages, no sightings, no trace. Britain launched one of the largest search efforts in exploration history. More than 40 expeditions would eventually be sent, by sea and by land, scouring the Arctic for any sign of Sir John Franklin and his men. What they found instead were fragments. A grave here, a piece of uniform there. Abandoned camps with no survivors. Each discovery contradicted the last. Some searchers reported signs of starvation. Others dismissed Inuit testimony describing dying men and cannibalism. Many refused to believe Royal Navy discipline could ever collapse so completely. Victorian Britain had a problem. The truth didn't fit the image. Inuit communities had seen Franklin's men years earlier, thin, sick, and moving south with boats dragged across ice. They described bodies left behind, cut bones, and desperate behavior. For decades, these accounts were ignored or dismissed as unreliable. Only much later would science confirm they were accurate. Search teams recovered notes left in stone cairns. One, dated April 1848, confirmed Franklin's death and the abandonment of the ships. It was the only official document ever recovered. The ships themselves remained lost. For more than 160 years, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sat beneath Arctic waters, preserved by cold and darkness. In 2014, Erebus was found. In 2016, Terror followed. Both were discovered not by British records, but by Inuit oral history that had been passed down for generations. The ships were astonishingly intact. Cabins still stood. Decks were preserved. Personal items lay where they had been left. They were not wrecked by storms. They had been abandoned. The Franklin expedition did not fail because of one catastrophic mistake. It failed because of accumulation, overconfidence, inflexibility. Technology trusted too much. Local knowledge ignored too completely. Cold did not kill them quickly. Hunger did not kill them all at once. Time did. By the time rescue might have been possible, the expedition had already crossed a point where survival was no longer an option. Today, the Franklin expedition stands as one of the most studied failures in exploration history. Not because it was reckless, but because it was careful in the wrong ways. The Arctic did not defeat the men immediately. It waited, And when it was finished, it left no survivors to tell the story themselves. Only bones, only ships, only silence.